morning. Okay, so let's see if I can get it. All right, that was okay? Yes. The standard question is, can you hear me back there in the rear? And the standard answer is no, we ain't built that way. Sorry. Okay. Let's see if we can convince Mr. Jobs that I'm legal. There we go. All right, so I actually have more material than there's time to talk about. So I'm going to try to compress a little bit. And I suspect that people are going to want to ask questions too. So I'm going to try to stick through some things. And if you're unhappy because I didn't dive deeply enough into something, we'll try to do some Q&A. Let me start out by explaining my title. I didn't ask for the title Chief Internet Evangelist. When I joined Google in October 2005, they said, what title do you want? And I said, well, how about Archduke? I thought that'd be a great title. And somebody pointed out that the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914 and started World War I. So maybe that's not a really great title to have. But considering what I've been doing for the last 35 years, is trying to get more internet built, they said, why don't you be our Chief Internet Evangelist? So on my first day of work, I wore my ecclesiastical robes. This is actually the formal academic robes of the University of the Balearic Islands in Spain. So this is not a made-up costume. This is actually a formal academic outfit. You can tell that the Spanish academic environment stems from an ecclesiastical setting because really those robes do look fairly religious. I mean, lace on the sleeves, holy cow. Okay, so let's get to the point. The last 10 or 11 years of internet evolution have been fairly spectacular in terms of growth. The number of servers on the network is over 500 million, and that's not counting laptops and PDAs. Over 1.3 billion users, which sounds big until you realize that there's 6.5 billion people in the world, so we're only about 20% penetrated. So the Chief Internet Evangelist has about 5.2 billion more people to convert. But the other statistic that's important on the net has been the number of mobiles that have shown up. There are about 4.1 billion telephone terminations in the world, but 3 billion of them are mobiles. This is just an incredible change in the picture of telephony over that period of time. But we all understand that those mobiles are not simple telephones. They're programmable devices. And we're using them in ways that no telephone was ever used before. So that's had a very dramatic impact on the internet because about 15% of those 3 million mobiles are internet enabled already, about 500 million devices. So many people in the world will have their first introduction to internet through a mobile rather than through a laptop. And those of us like Google who serve users on the internet with various applications are faced with the challenges of trying to deal with small screen sizes, small keyboard sizes, and variable data rates in order to present internet-based services. If you look at the distribution of users on this, probably on a chart for some of you in the back, it's an interesting thing to discover that Asia has 500 million users of internet. That includes China and India, Indonesia and Malaysia and so on. They are the single largest segment of users in the net. In fact, if we look at it this way, you can see this is pretty dramatic. A few years ago, it would have been North America that had the single largest grouping of users, but that's no longer true. Europe is the next largest grouping. Of course, Europe is a little confusing because they keep adding countries, so the definition of Europe keeps changing. You can't quite make an easy prediction about how big will Europe get. The important point, though, has to do with penetration. In North America, the penetration rate on average is over 70% of the population using the net. In the Pacific Islands, and Australia, New Zealand, and so on, it's about almost 60%. In Europe, it's only 43%. Of course, it varies dramatically from about 5% in the lowest to 70 or 80% in the highest. We go to places like Norway and Sweden, we see 75 to 80% penetration of internet use. In Asia, it's only a little under 14%. So here they are. Asia has 500 million users, only 14% penetration. So if you use the math, when they reach 70%, they will have billions of users online. There are implications of that. One of them is that we will have more content in the languages of Asia than we are likely to have in any of the other languages spoken in the world. And that changes the flavor of that. Culture and customs and things like that will also vary pretty significantly across the world, and Asia in particular. So the face of the internet will change over time because of the dominance of that kind of content. Africa, of course, is the lowest penetration. Every country in Africa has some internet service, but often it's concentrated in the capital, frequently maybe only the big university in the capital. The infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure in Africa is generally immature, and also the economies are quite varied. So that's a really tough challenge to get more internet capability into that part of the world. The growth rates have been fairly spectacular. The Middle East has grown on the internet dramatically in the last several years, in the last 8 years roughly, almost by a factor of 1,000%. I thought we'd go back into time for just a moment. This is what the predecessor to the internet looked like in 1969. And I was lucky enough to be a graduate student at UCLA writing the software in a computer called Sigma 7 to connect the first hosts to the ARPANET in 1969. The Sigma 7 is now in a museum, and some people suggested I should be there too, but here I am. That system had one, there were many milestones, but the one that we celebrated recently, last year, that was the most significant for me, was the first time we got 3 different packet switch nets all interacting with each other at the same time using the then brand new TCP/IP protocols. We had a packet radio network which was operating here in the Bay Area. SRI International was responsible for organizing the tests. We put packet radio receivers, transceivers in the mountaintops in the area, and then put transceivers in mobile equipment. And we would drive around the Bayshore area testing the transmission system. So the mobile radio system was here. We used spread spectrum technology. This is 1975, 76 timeframe. Spread spectrum operating at between 100 and 400 kilobits a second in 1975, 76. The ARPANET itself, which had been built in the late 1960s and early 70s, which stretched all the way to Europe by this time. By 1977, they had a satellite link linking the U.S. portion of ARPANET to Norway, and then by landline down to UC, University College London. And then a packet satellite system, which used INSAT 4A, sitting over the Atlantic, linking Europe and the U.S., with multiple ground stations all sharing a common 64 kilobit channel. So it was an aloha channel in the sky, basically. So there are 3 very different packet switch networks, different data rates, different packet sizes, and so on. And the whole question, of course, is how to link all that together to look very uniform. So the first time we ever got all 3 of these nets working together was November 22nd, 1977. And we sort of artificially set things up because the packet radio band was trying to communicate with University, the USC, Information Sciences Institute in Marina del Rey. That's about 400 miles south. But the packets were actually being run through a gateway. We didn't know we were supposed to call them routers. We call them gateways. Through a gateway that artificially sent the traffic all the way across the ARPANET through the satellite link down to Norway and London, through another gateway in London, up to the packet satellite net, then through another gateway in Etam, West Virginia, and then all the way across the ARPANET again, and then down to USC. So if you do the math and you take into account all the satellite hops and everything else, plus back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean and the U.S., it's about 100,000 miles for that 440-mile trip. And what was amazing is that it worked. If you have anything to do with software, but anybody who writes software knows that mostly it bugs. And so we're leaking up and down streaming. It works as if it couldn't possibly have worked. And I was so excited about this, I drew this picture and had it framed, and I sent it to the head of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, who was sponsoring this thing. As the proof that our idea wasn't totally crazy. I figured any pair of networks could be connected together to demonstrate something, but by the time you start getting more than 2 things to work together, suddenly you have the technology that makes sense. And just to point out the irony of all this, a few miles away from my laboratory at Stanford was Xerox PARC, and Bob Metcalf was doing Ethernet in 1973. So literally in parallel, he's doing Ethernet, I'm doing Internet, and of course our students and colleagues intermixed with each other during the early 1970s. we knew about the Ethernet technology too, so there were really 4 packet switch technologies that we were aware of, both Tom and I, at the time we were doing this work. Of course, if you fast forward, the internet looks like this. You know, it's more connected, it got bigger, it's more colorful, and that's about as good a definition of internet as anything I can think of right now. So what is it that's driven all this? One of the things that has made the internet work so well is that when Bob and I started this work, we knew that there would be new technologies invented that we didn't know about for transmission and switching. So we said we want the internet protocol to run on top of any of them. So I had a t-shirt made that said IT on everything. And that's what I've been doing for the last 30 years. And the point here is that it works because there is very little assumption made at the IP layer about what's underlying it, how the bits are being carried. As long as the bits can be carried from point A to point B for some probability greater than 0, that's adequate for running on the internet. The thing I didn't really appreciate as much then as I do now is that the packets not only don't care how they're carried, but they don't care what they're carrying. So this end-to-end principle says the network itself doesn't know what the applications are. It's not tailored to those applications. It simply carries bits from one place to another. And so we have this sort of, what was it, one guy called it the rise of the stupid network, because the network doesn't know what applications are running. It's simply an end-to-end thing. It's the computers at the edges of the net that interpret the packets. So some of them have bits of email, some of them have parts of the web page, some of them have streaming video or audio. The network doesn't really care. Just anything that's digital is suitable for carriage across the net. What's really critical about that end-to-end principle is that you didn't have to get permission from the internet service provider in order to put up a new application. So when the guys that started Yahoo or Google or Amazon and so on did their thing, they didn't have to get permission from some ISP to try out their new application. This has come to be known as net neutrality or the end-to-end principle, and it's really important because that is what has driven all of the internet's expansion over the last 20 years. It's been the freedom to try out new applications and make them accessible to a network-wide and now worldwide user base. In fact, there's some threat to that right now. The mention of Comcast is just a little example of an issue that is arising, and that is the possibility that the broadband carriers are going to interfere with that non-discriminatory posture. Just to remind you of something, in the period of time, let's say in the early 90s to about, let's say, the mid-90s or so, most of the access to the internet was through dial-up. The implication of that was that it was very easy for you to switch from one internet service provider to another. You just changed the phone number. So it's very, very low barrier to switching. As soon as you introduce broadband services, suddenly it's more expensive to switch. First of all, somebody has to do a build-out. Maybe there's a truck roll before you've got broadband capability. And second, switching is a big deal. First of all, you may not even have a choice of switching to anybody. In many parts of the U.S., if you have broadband at all, you have a choice of only one supplier. In some places, you have a choice of 2, and 2 is not a highly competitive number. And so, at least in the United States, we don't have a lot of competition. But normally, competition is what drives people towards matching user demand. Users want open access to the internet. They want as high speed as possible. Frankly, a lot of them like symmetric speeds, which we don't get often with our broadband providers. But in fact, there isn't enough competition to drive the market. And in fact, because many of the internet service providers are unique to the particular subscriber, switching is not an option. And your broadband service is whatever gets called wiggy-wig. What you get is what you get. So there's a big issue there. It's very tempting if you're a broadband provider to say, well, I'm in control of this pipe. I can offer all kinds of applications, and oh, by the way, I can even interfere, if I wanted to, with competing applications like streaming video coming from some other supplier on the other side of the net. And during the period when net neutrality was in high debate with regard to legislation, that would be considered to insist that the broadband providers keep the network open. All of the broadband providers said, oh, we'd never interfere with anybody's traffic. It wouldn't be in our best interest to do that, blah, blah, blah. And then the debate sort of petered out. No legislation was passed. And shortly thereafter, we started seeing some evidence that there was real interference taking place with regard to applications running on the network. And a good example of that is the situation with Comcast. Now, I want to be fair about something here because it's easy to just paint everybody black, and that's not fair. The Comcast guys have a network which is asymmetric in its basic structure. The uplink has less capacity than the downlink. It's just a legacy of the design of the cable system. If you go to DOCSIS 3.0, you begin to see more opportunity for symmetry, but they aren't there yet. So they have a congestion problem on the uplink, and they could potentially have a congestion problem on the downlink, even though it has higher speeds. And so the engineers there were trying to find some way of managing the capacity so that no small number of or one consumer could take all of the capacity. That was one of the, so they were concerned about traffic engineering, but they picked a particularly crude way of dealing with the problem by sending resets to the other side for people who happen to be running Bitcoin, for instance. So they have announced that they are going to adopt a different tactic. Now, I can't speak for them because I don't know all the details, but my understanding is they're trying to find a way of doing network management that is based solely on the capacity that the consumers are using and has nothing to do with the applications that they're running. They're trying to make a fair access to the network for everybody. And I think that we should encourage them to proceed in that direction. But it's a big issue. Now, the symmetry thing that I mentioned before is another big issue. In other parts of the world, people have access to very high speeds. In Japan, for example, you can buy gigabit per second service for about 8,700 yen a month. And it's symmetric. In Sweden, in Stockholm, it's really amazing. You can buy dark fiber for about 100 euros a month. And Peter Wasberg, a friend of mine, who's an engineer at Cisco, put in a 40 gigabit per second service for his mom. I have no idea what she does with 40 gig access to the internet, but you can do this in Stockholm because the city started a company that is this laying the dark fiber in all the conduits that are available in sewers and everything else around the city, and you light them up yourself. So that was very clever of them because they had no optoelectronics to worry about. It was just fiber. The fiber breaks, they pull another fiber. So it's a nice abstraction point at which to offer service. So here we are in the U.S. with a very different set of offerings, not nearly as satisfactory. And it's ironic, sometimes you could receive high-quality video, but you can't send it. So much for that video conference that we're hoping to have, to see the grandchildren, well, maybe not really or old young, but maybe through friends and family. Okay, so symmetry, I think, is going to be demanded by a lot of the users, and we're at an intermediate place right now in U.S. broadband services. Obviously, radio is supplying mobility. And finally, everybody knows this, but this chart is important, not for any of the lines on it except the one that's going down. The line that's going down says how much address space is left at ICANN in the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority to allocate IPv4 addresses to the regional Internet registries. They're going to run out of IPv4 address allocations somewhere between 2010 and 2011. So it's absolutely essential to move to IPv6. I'm really proud to tell you that Google has demonstrated an ability to support IPv6 now. We just, at the IETF meeting in Philadelphia, participated in the IPv4 outage that said for several hours we just shut down IPv4. The only way you can get access to the internet is through IPv6 at that conference. And Google's search engine is at ipv6.google.com. And it's going to stay up and running. We know there are some bugs and things that we have to fix, but I wanted to push the company to be visible publicly in moving towards IPv6 because until we show the ISPs that there is a real demand for V6, they're not going to turn it on. And so I don't want to have a train wreck in 2011 or 2012 when we all ran out of V4 for address space. Okay. I'm not going to go through all these things. I want to show you 3 slides that demonstrate that there is plenty of room for continued research in improving the way the internet works. Now, given the fact that you're gathered here because of your interest in the details of protocols and how they behave on the network, at least that's what I'm assuming, you wouldn't be using the Wireshark tool if you weren't interested in it. I want to simply alert you to the opportunity for doing new design. In spite of the fact that the internet is now 30-some-odd years old, terms of its design and architecture. There are things that we didn't do, like multi-homing is not well done in the internet today. Mobility is not well handled in the internet today. There are some possibilities of adding identifiers above the level of IP that would decouple the endpoint identification from the routing. Today, it's coupled together. The IP address of TCP layer is the same as the IP address of the IP layer. They share the two things with a pseudo header. At the time, I thought this was clever because it kind of reused the technique and it was conservative, but it was dumb actually because in the end, it meant that you couldn't do dual homing easily. And it's not something that I had understood then, but I really appreciate now. Multi-path routing, when we have multiple paths between two systems, we don't actually take both paths or three paths at the same time, we only pick one. We can get more capacity if we did that more carefully. We don't use broadcast very well. We take broadcast channels and turn them into point-to-point links, so we do with Wi-Fi. Well, that's stupid if you happen to have data that you want lots of people to get at the same time. We should be using the natural feature of broadcast, which is that more than one party can receive the thing that you transmitted. So if we're transferring large amounts of data, broadcast would be really cool. Satellite sitting up here could be broadcasting IP traffic, which could be anything, right? It could be video or audio or a program or text or what have you. But multiple parties could receive it. It would be much more efficient. Of course, if you lose a packet, you recover from that by retransmitting on a point-to-point basis. So we don't have any of that in the architecture. We have multicast, but I don't think that worked out very well. So there's work to be done here to improve the Internet's utility. And there's plenty of room for people who are looking for PhD dissertations and things like that. Another side of this coin is security and authenticity in the net. It's weak. And we see weaknesses all the time. You see problems with security. Presumably you're using some of the tools, the Wireshark tools, in order to figure out who's attacking or what is the nature of the particular problem that's showing up in the net. We don't have good authenticity in the network. We don't know where packets are coming from. People can spoof IP addresses, which is not a good thing. And I'm sure that some of you might be sitting here thinking, okay, you're telling us all this stuff, why didn't you do it right the first time? And the answer is, well, at the time, we didn't even know if any of this was going to work. And so we were focused on, can we get it to work at all? And looking back on it, if I had had the opportunity, and I would have put more strong authentication into the architecture. The trouble is that we standardized TCP around 1978. The first papers on public key cryptography came out in 1977 with Diffie and Marty Hellman on the Stanford campus were doing that work. I knew them, and I knew what they were doing, but RSA, the algorithm, hadn't been invented yet. And I was, at 5 years into the program at DARPA, trying to get this thing up and running. It simply could not take the time to wait for that technology to mature. And to make things even more ironic, in '75, while I was still on the Stanford campus, I started working with the National Security Agency on a fully secure net, but it was classified, so I couldn't tell any of my colleagues how it worked or what we did to it. So, the systems kind of evolved separately. So here we are today. We don't have good authentication. We don't have good identity management. I'm not going to spend time on the rest of this today. I have a few other things I want to talk about. But I just want to encourage you to think about the possibilities that are still open in the Internet, unsolved problems that can be attacked. In mobile, particularly, there are all kinds of possibilities that need attention. And even, I should tell you that I don't have time to do this very well. There's an interplanetary extension of the Internet that I've been working on for the past 10 years. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory team and I have got protocols defined now, and we've tested them terrestrially. This year, assuming that NASA passes the budget that we're asking for, we will put the interplanetary Internet protocols on board the Deep Space Impact platform, and we'll run a deep space test of the protocols. Assuming that all works out well, we're going through something called the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems, which is a standardization group for space data communications. They will presumably adopt the new bundle-based protocols. They're not TCP/IP because, in fact, we discovered that TCP/IP didn't work very well with a round-trip time of 40 minutes. There's another little problem too. Not only do we have an astronomical delay, going back and forth between planets, but the damn planets are rotating and they're in motion. So when you're talking to something on the surface of a planet that rotates out of view, you can't talk to it for a while. So we get celestial motion interferes. It's a disruptive environment. So we designed a whole new suite of protocols called delay and disruption tolerant networking. And if you go have a look at RFC 5050 or RFC 4838, it gets some flavor for what's going on there. Okay, a couple of other observations. For many, many years, the broad spread media, whether it's newspapers, magazines, or radio, television, and so on, were a small number of sources and a large number of receivers. The internet comes along and says, well, I can do all that, but I can also allow anybody receiving things to inject things into the net. So suddenly, the consumers of information have become the producers. And we see it with blogging, YouTube, and personal web pages and the like. In fact, I have a statistic to show you about YouTube, which is pretty stunning. So we're seeing this inversion that never happened before. So the internet creates a kind of democratic environment that we never had in terms of expressiveness on a global scale. Innovation is also a hallmark of internet's architecture. Wikipedia is a very good example. Imagine that you're reading a paragraph of Wikipedia and you find one word that's wrong. And you know that it's wrong because you're an expert. You're allowed to go change that, assuming you haven't locked the page. So it's kind of interesting. You never publish a one-word scholarly paper, or you wouldn't publish a one-word book. But you can put a one-word change in Wikipedia that's useful for people who happen to be looking at that paragraph. So the barrier to introducing content on the net is zero. The exciting thing. We're seeing social networking activities arising, although to be honest, they've been with us for a very long time. When email was invented in 1970, network email was invented in 1971. Some of the first email lists were about science fiction and restaurants. Stanford had Yum Yum, which was a distribution list that just had people's opinions of restaurants in the local area. So social networking has been part of the internet's environment for a long time, but it's enriched now by all the things like MySpace, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and so on. Just one comment about business models. The economics of digital information are dramatically different than the economics of physical atoms. So, as an example, a few months ago, I bought 2 terabytes of memory for use at home, disk storage, for use at home for about $600. And I got to thinking, gee, in 1979, I bought a 10 megabyte disk drive the size of a shoebox for $1,000. Then I got to thinking, what would have happened if I tried to buy a terabyte of memory in 1979? And when you do the math, it comes out to $100 million. So I came home looking at my little 2 terabyte disk, thinking, God, that's $100 million worth of storage. Now, I didn't have $100 million in 1979, and to be honest, I don't have $100 million now either. But if I had $100 million in 1979, I'm pretty sure my wife would let me spend it on disk drive. That's something else to say. The point I want to make, though, is that the cost of digital processing, whether it's transmission or storage or processing, has dropped so dramatically that business models that rely on other media with different cost bases are threatened. So newspapers are threatened, and book publishers, magazines, and so on, are threatened in some sense by the economics. And this sort of suggests that there's a Darwinian imperative here. Darwin tells us we only have 2 choices, right? Adapt or die. And so companies that can't adapt to the new economics, and they actually find their business models don't work anymore. Standards is something that I could preach on all day in a moment. I just want to say that standards are the only thing that allow the internet to do what it does. The fact that we can plug into the net and expect to reasonably interact with 500 million other devices on the system is only a result of standards. And so I'm a big fan of getting standards right. Sometimes getting the standard right is more valuable than writing a line of code. And occasionally I have to fight people at Google about that. This is the chart that I wanted to show you. It's intended to illustrate a couple of things. This is Sandvine's view of a particular access line. And what you're seeing in that kind of gray area there that's labeled YouTube is the percentage of that access circuit that's consumed with YouTube traffic, and roughly it's about 10%. The statistic I heard the other day that really surprised me is that we get about 10 hours of video per minute coming into the internet, into the YouTube system right now. 10 hours per minute. It used to be 8, now it's gone up. So the 2 points to make are, first of all, that new applications, YouTube is only about 2.5 to 3 years old, new applications can come along to consume a lot of capacity on the net unexpectedly. And second, we could change again. 2 years from now, there may be another set of applications whose demand on the network will look different. There may not be more demand, just may be more variable demand. Once again, Wireshark may actually help us figure that out, or at least observe it. Speaking of TV, many people who talk about streaming video, or talk about IPTV, think streaming video. And I want to argue that that's too narrow a point of view. As memory becomes cheaper, and as data rates go up, you get to the point where IPTV is not watching the video while it's being transmitted. If you're using iPods, you may have noticed that you're downloading stuff faster than you can listen to it, and then you play it back whenever you want to. Imagine being on a gigabit channel, accessing the internet. You can download about an hour's worth of video in 16 seconds. So video on demand is no longer a streaming video application, rather it is downloading and playing back. The reason that I find that so interesting is that not only can you download it faster than real time, but if you happen to have a lower data rate, you could download it slower than real time. You would want to watch the frames coming up 7 frames a second, but you can load it in the background and then play it back whenever you want to. So the idea of treating video, the medium video, as a file transfer instead of a streaming medium is very attractive for 2 reasons. It works across all data rates, and second, it doesn't put as much strain on the network. Because to do streaming video, you have to make sure the packet gets there in the right order, or the video or the audio will break up. But if you're just doing a file transfer, it doesn't matter if the packets get out of order or retransmitted to you. Now, I'm not arguing that streaming video is useless, not by a long shot. But only about 15% of all the video that people watch, entertainment video that people watch today is real time. It's news, sporting events, and sometimes emergencies. But the rest of the 85% that people watch is actually pre-recorded material that could be downloaded and played back. Now, on the other hand, video conferencing clearly has to be a real-time proposition. So my sense here is that we're going to see a very different way in which video emerges as part of the internet than traditional broadcast of video on satellite radio or over the air and cable. The other thing I wanted to mention is that when you start downloading IP files, they don't have to be just video and audio. They can contain all kinds of other material as well. And so you can imagine having videos composed out of digital information that is something you can interact with. So imagine you're watching a movie and there's a caught-up pricing when maybe there's an Macintosh in the middle of the scene and zooms in on the Apple. Apple Computer Corporation pays for the privilege of having their stuff invisible in the film. What's interesting is that when you start digitizing everything, you can imagine being able to move your mouse over that particular object in the field of view and clicking on it. And the window opens up. The system says, hi, I see you're interested in this Macintosh. This is model so-and-so. You can buy this. Click here if you're interested in more information. You have to be online. You could order one because the inventory is stored in this much. You can imagine a very different kind of advertising experience as a consequence of the technology of digital video. And I submit to you that that's an unexplored territory that will put more control in the hands of the consumers instead of simply having interrupted the video entertainment by forcing you to watch a particular advertisement. Mobiles we talked a little bit about. I just want to reemphasize that they are extraordinarily versatile devices if they are an open platform especially. Most of the mobiles today are not very open. You can't download software into them at will. You basically have to run only the applications that the wireless providers or the platform makers are willing to offer. Google has made an attempt to open that up with the Android operating system, which would allow for more downloading than third-party software. But the thing I wanted to emphasize at the moment is that once you start having access to internet resources from a mobile, you get a very different visceral sense of what it means to have information whenever you want it. I appreciated that intellectually, but not viscerally until I went on vacation in May last year. My wife and I went with some friends to a place called Lake Powell. You can rent houseboats on the lake. And so we're on our way to Page, Arizona. It's a little town right on the lake. And thinking about what we were going to make while we were out on the lake. There were no grocery stores, so you have to buy all the food that you eat ahead of time. We were trying to figure out what should we make for dinner while we're on the lake for a few days. Somebody says, well, I want to have paella. thought, well, that's really, I like pie, but you have to have saffron for that. Where the hell am I going to find saffron in Page, Arizona? So, by good fortune, I had a good GPRS signal, and I brought up Google while we're driving in. I said, saffron in Page, Arizona, the grocery store. And a little response came back with a map, the name of the store, and the telephone number. So I clicked on the telephone number, and a voice answered. I said, hello, I'd like to speak to the spice department, please. And it's probably a tiny little grocery. It's the owner. This is the spice department. And I said, well, do you have any saffron? He says, I don't know. He goes off and looks and comes back and says, yeah, I got some. So we followed the map, and I ran in and bought $12.99 worth of saffron, and we went off and we made our pie. The point I want to make is that in real time, an information need was satisfied, and it was local information. And so geographically indexed information is turning out to be tremendously valuable, especially when your information access is on your hip or in your purse. And so this idea of having access to geographically significant information in real time is a real transforming kind of event. Just one last thing, and then I'm going to stop because we're running out of time. If you have been following the internet like I have, you've been surprised by some of the things that are showing up as devices on the net, like refrigerators and picture frames and telephones that aren't really telephones and computers and voice over IP. But really surprising is the guy in the middle has an internet-enabled surfboard. I guess he was sitting maybe from San Diego, right? Sitting on the water, waiting for the next wave, and he's thinking, if I had a laptop on my surfboard, I would be surfing the internet while I'm waiting to surf the So he put a laptop inside the surfboard, and I guess the Wi-Fi transceiver in the rescue shack on the beach. And now he sells this as a product. So, I don't know who else has Wi-Fi hotspots in the rescue shacks, but if you go to San Diego, you can use this. So I'm predicting that there are going to be billions of internet devices on the net. Probably there will be more devices than there are people. Because if you think of the number of appliances that you use every day, that you carry around with you, either in the car or in the office or at home, a lot of them will be internet enabled. And they'll be interacting with you, or they're interacting with control systems, or interacting with each other. And so I'm expecting to see tens of billions of devices online as time goes on. And they're going to have lots of interesting characteristics. One of them that occurred to me is that how when we send astronauts up, they have instrumented coding, and we keep track of their vital signs by transmitting data back about heart rate and breathing and so on. So I got to thinking, what would happen if all of our codes were internet enabled? What could you do? Well, let's see. We could send an SNMP packet to the sock drawer, and you get back a report saying there are 17 matched pairs of socks, except 144L is missing. So we could send a multicaster in the house. An RFID chip or something in the sock, and we get back a report saying, hello, this is sock 144L, I'm under the sofa in the living room. We solved the problem of the missing sock, which I think is a huge contribution to society. Okay, well, there's lots of other stuff. I'm going to stop with one last point. This year, 2008, is a very significant time for the internet because it is going to be introducing some very significant new features. V6, of course, has been around since 1996, but I'm starting to see significant momentum in implementation as people recognize that we really are going to run out of unique IPv4 in that space. We're going to be introducing internationalized domain names. These are domain names that are written in characters other than Latin. Right now it's just the A through Z and the 0 to 9 and hyphen. You're going to see domain names written in Cyrillic and Chinese and Hangul or Korean and so on. Arabic and Hebrew and so forth. That's actually a major change in the appearance of the network, even though we're going to a lot of trouble to map that down into simple ASCII strings down in the domain name system itself. Generic TLDs are going to be coming in the latter half of 2008, including internationalized domain names. And finally, the domain name system security in a sec is going to be introduced, although I'm beginning to believe it's not going to be introduced as widely as some of us had hoped. It's probably going to wind up being some specialty things like banks and other financial institutions that maybe healthcare institutions that want to make sure that we've got the right destination. But .se, Sweden, Bulgaria, Brazil, and Puerto Rico are all currently digitally signing their own files. And I'm hoping to see more and more of that this year. Let me stop there. There's lots more I could talk about. Ask if you have some questions. Am I allowed to just stretch a little bit? I apologize. apologize for just totally disrupting your calendar. But if there are questions or anything you want to raise, yes, sir.
Fred Wolfhorn with Security. You speak often of internet rather than the internet. I'm curious
well, let's see. This is probably a force of habit. The question is, I talk about internet instead of the internet. Maybe in my head it's always capitalized I, but in fact, usage for many years was lowercase internet and anything that was using the TCP/IP protocols, even if it wasn't connected to the big public internet. And so when I'm thinking internet, I'm thinking big public internet. But for many of us, the technologies work just as well in private settings. And in fact, you'll find a lot of companies, including Google, that use private IP address space in order to build internal systems that don't connect in any direct way to the rest of the network. But the security technology should work in both cases. That's it. Let me get this gentleman over here, and I'll go with him. This is part of my Geraldo shtick. Just to explain what's going on here, I'm hearing impaired. And I don't want to be a guy that came to talk and wouldn't listen, so sometimes they have to lip read, and that's why I'm...
Can you comment on the current net neutrality and where you see that going and where you'd like to see that go in isolation?
Okay, so the net neutrality going to go, what's going to happen next? The theme that I followed in net neutrality will probably be more along non-discriminatory terms. The term net neutrality has been badly distorted by the parties who are arguing, making it sound as if the people who spoke in favor of net neutrality, it should be identical and that they're... am I fading in and out? Why is that? How's this? Is it, I don't think it's my voice that's doing it. Okay, so... Sorry about that. I couldn't resist. So I think that the arguments were very badly distorted initially, and those of us who were supporting net neutrality were made to appear as if we were saying that every packet had to be identically created, you couldn't do any prioritization, and you couldn't defend against denial of service attacks, you couldn't filter viruses. Well, that's really a distortion of what we were saying. All we were saying is that we didn't want the providers of underlying transmission technology to unfairly discriminate against competitors. That's really all we were saying. And so I think if there is a theme that arises, it will be on the non-discriminatory side of the equation. My understanding is that Congressman Markey has introduced legislation again that is attempting to achieve that kind of non-discriminatory effect. And I'm very supportive of that. I'm hoping that rational heads will prevail. Frankly, some of the things that you are capable of doing with the tools that you have and the interests that you have will help. Because if the internet service providers, especially the broadband ones, understand that discrimination may be exposed through direct measurement, then they may actually think twice about trying to engage in it unfairly or inappropriately. Just to make sure it's understood, I'm not against, for example, filtering viruses out. I'm not against defending against denial of service attacks. But I'll give you an example. If I'm using an internet service provider for access to the internet, but I'm using some other provider's email service, I don't need to have my email tracked by the internet service access provider. I need the filtering to be done at a higher level protocol. And so I'd like to see practices that focus on the appropriate target or the appropriate supplier to perform these functions. Besides which, I don't really think you can effectively filter out things like viruses and worms by looking at every single packet flowing through the net. It's not a very effective tool. There's another gentleman.
I was wondering what your view was on software-related patents, like when they're purchasing and how it impacts it.
Okay, software-related patents and open source software, what is the impact? I have long been uncomfortable with software patents. It's not that the principle is necessarily broken. I mean, a thing done in software is different than a thing done in hardware. But the reason I've been uncomfortable with them is that patents have been granted that are really not for unique and inventive things. In fact, there's anecdotal evidence, and again, I don't know how it was considered to be one of those urban legends, but I have heard stories of patents granted for bubble storage, which we all learned in, programming 101. So the problem here is that the patent examiners don't necessarily have a deep understanding of what has become common knowledge in software. Besides which, a piece of software is a pretty complicated piece of logic, and it isn't always clear what should or should not be covered in a kind of patent claim. Open source and patenting are not necessarily in contradiction with each other. You can imagine releasing open source and still claiming patent rights on something. That might give people some pause about whether they want to use your open source because of the licensing requirements. Some people will seek patent-like protection because they want to protect their ability to use what they've done. That's a defensive use of patents. And I can understand that. If you've invented something, and you can publicly say you can have a perpetual, universal license to use this software, whether it's open source or not. I just don't want you to prevent me from using my own invention. And so that's a defensive use of patents, and that's I think that's a fair thing that you're concerned about, being able to use your own ideas. Generally speaking, though, to go back to standards for just a second, I prefer non-intellectual property standards that do not rely on intellectual property. So in the Internet Engineering Task Force, for example, there is a natural desire to avoid patented technology where possible in order to make sure that the standards can continue to evolve. So, if I had my choice, I wouldn't go down the software patent path. Okay, other questions? Yes, sir, and then one here.
Just as a
This
fun
is part of my exercise program. Yes?
as a fun question,
Okay.
how do you think RFID technology will progress along with the internet?
Okay, so the question is,
What about RFID
technology and how is that going to progress along with the internet? Well, I'm hoping my socks will have RFID. Actually, I'll tell you, I am determined to get an RFID detector and RFID chips on the bottles of wine in my wine cellar. Right now, I'm instrumented the wine cellar and watching temperature and humidity on a regular basis. It's reported to a little server, and I can check to see if everything's okay, and if there's a problem, if the temperature is not up too fast, I get an SMS on my BlackBerry to tell me there's trouble with traffic or image. So the RFID chips would be very helpful to make sure that the bottle hasn't left the cellar, undetected. People are worried, however, about the possible abuse of RFID chips. And the question is, who is sensing the chips? What information can they get from those chips? People who use the RFID detectors to go back and forth through toll roads, for example, that's a very convenient thing. You don't have to stop and put money in the hopper. On the other hand, what if there were detectors that you didn't know about that were also detecting the presence of your car? What would people do with that? And some people would see that as a potential violation of privacy. So I think there's some sensitivity there. I doubt, though, that you would expect that someone would track a particular box of cereal that you bought at the store. And I would assume that the RFID chip in that thing would probably be generic. Right? This is a box of Cheerios, and you can't tell one box of Cheerios from another box of Cheerios. But, of course, the conspiracy theorists will often come up with scenarios that are scary. So this does raise the question of what can people know about other people, and at what point does that become a violation of privacy? I'm told that if you're in London, that you're probably caught on camera at least 40 times a day, and maybe 10 times that. And there is a certain sense of discomfort, I think, for some people. On the other hand, when the tube had those bombers came and blew up part of the tube station, having all that video capability turned out to be very helpful. So we are in the middle of a really interesting tension in this society, and it's the tension between privacy to protect individuals and protection of the society itself from people who might do it harm. And so we're trying to find where we should go with that. Personally, I think that RFID chips won't be a big issue until they get to be so cheap that they can be reproduced for 50 cents or something. And we're probably not far away from that, because if you've been looking at the paper printed circuits that are now technically feasible, you can imagine very, very inexpensive RFID capability wrapped in a label on one bottle. So I think it would be wise to be sensitive to the potential misuse and to be alert to that. But I don't think that this sort of technology is like a tidal wave. We can't stand on the edge of the ocean and say stop, and it doesn't work. You just have to figure out how to go with it. I think we have time for maybe one more. So I'll hand up to your example.
How do you feel about what they've done in Utah, where you have a high-speed publicly owned network and you grant these consumers?
So this is like municipal kinds of networks and things like that. A number. What about municipal networks and other high-speed nets that people might own instead of companies? Or maybe separating. I'm going to extend your question even if you didn't mean to, and ask whether we should segregate the basic underlying transmission system from the other higher level applications and create companies that are only interested in doing transport of this. Personally, I think it is technically possible to build a good business model based solely on transport. The consumers have to be prepared to pay whatever that cost is in order to make that business model work. And I think that would give us a lot more flexibility than we have today. And it would remove the separation, would remove some of the threats. In other parts of the world, we're seeing a lot of attention being paid to wholesale services and requirement that the providers of broadband keep the system open to other parties who are offering higher level services. So in the UK, for example, it's a requirement on British Telecom, and they're making a very good business out of wholesale. In the US, we've seen some real pushback from broadband service providers trying to force legislation at the state level to prevent municipal networks from being built. Because if the claim is that that's government competing with the private sector, then it's really a very distorted view, because what typically would happen is the municipal group, the citizens would pass a bill to float a bond to pay for the capital costs of install and maybe some operation. But it's the private sector would actually do the work. The issue is that it isn't necessarily the broadband cable company or the broadband telephone company that would do it. It might be a competitor. So the first order, I'm in favor of these kinds of networks, but I think we need to see some examples of real operating systems that are self-supporting and self-sustaining in order to convince everyone that that's a reasonable path to go down. But I'm in favor of it. Okay, that's all the time I've got. I hope you have a great conference, and sorry I can't stay